There is a country on the southwestern tip of the Arabian Peninsula that was once called Arabia Felix, Happy Arabia. The Romans gave it that name because compared to the vast, lifeless deserts that covered the rest of the peninsula, this corner was different. It had mountains that caught monsoon rains. It had terraced hillsides where farmers grew crops in soil that was actually fertile. It had ports that controlled the trade routes between India, East Africa, and the Mediterranean. It produced frankincense and myrrh, commodities so valuable that the ancient world considered them worth more than gold. For centuries, Yemen was the richest, greenest, most strategically blessed territory in all of Arabia. Today, Yemen is the site of what the United Nations calls the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. Over 22 million people, roughly half the population, need humanitarian assistance. 18.3 million are acutely food insecure. More than 2.2 million children under 5 are acutely malnourished, including over 500,000 suffering from severe acute malnutrition. Over 14.5 million people lack access to safe drinking water. More than 450 health facilities have been forced to close. The civil war that began in 2014 has killed over 227,000 people, displaced 4.8 million, and shattered an economy that was already among the poorest in the Middle East. And the question that almost nobody asks is why. Not why the war started. There are political explanations for that involving Houthis and Saudis and Iranians and Americans. But why this country? Why does Yemen keep collapsing? Why has it never been stable for more than a generation? Why does every attempt at unification, modernization, or peace eventually fail? The answer is geography. Yemen's landscape is not a backdrop to the crisis. It is the crisis. The mountains, the deserts, the coastline, the water. Every feature of Yemen's physical geography contributes to a set of conditions that make sustained stability almost impossible. And understanding that geography is the only way to understand why Happy Arabia became the most miserable place on Earth. If this kind of geographic deep dive is what brings you to YouTube, subscribe to Uncharted Geography right now. We cover the places the world forgets, and Yemen might be the most important forgotten story on the planet. Yemen can be divided into 5 distinct geographic zones, and each one creates a different set of problems. The first is the Tihama, a narrow coastal plain running along the Red Sea on Yemen's western edge. It ranges from 8 to 65 kilometers wide, flat, sandy, and brutally hot. Summer temperatures regularly exceed 45 degrees Celsius. Humidity from the Red Sea makes the heat feel even more oppressive. The Tihama receives less than 130 millimeters of rain per year, and many years record no measurable precipitation at all. This is one of the most inhospitable coastal environments in the Middle East, and yet it is one of Yemen's most important agricultural zones. Farmers here depend on seasonal flood irrigation from wadis, dry riverbeds that briefly carry water when it rains in the mountains above. When the rain comes, the Tihama produces sorghum, millet, and fruit. When it does not, the crops fail and the farmers have nothing. Behind the Tihama, the land rises sharply into the western highlands, mountains that climb from sea level to over 3,000 meters in just a few dozen kilometers. These highlands are Yemen's backbone. They catch the monsoon moisture that the lowlands miss, receiving between 400 and 750 millimeters of rain per year, enough to support terraced agriculture that has been practiced here for over 3,000 years. The terraces of Yemen are among the most sophisticated traditional agricultural systems in the world. Stone-walled steps carved into near-vertical mountainsides that capture rain, prevent erosion, and create narrow bands of farmable land where no flat ground exists. The highlands are where most Yemenis have always lived. Sana'a, the capital, sits at 2,300 meters above sea level in a mountain basin. Taiz, the country's third-largest city, sits in the highlands at roughly 1,400 meters. The highlands are cooler, greener, and more productive than the rest of the country, and they have been the population center of Yemen for millennia. But the same mountains that make the highlands livable also make the country ungovernable. The central mountain massif, the Yemen highlands, contains peaks exceeding 3,600 meters, making it the highest terrain on the entire Arabian Peninsula. These mountains do not form a single ridge. They form a chaotic maze of peaks, valleys, plateaus, and wadis that slice the highlands into hundreds of isolated pockets. Communities in one valley can be just a few kilometers from communities in the next valley, separated by a mountain wall that takes hours or days to cross on foot. This terrain bred the tribal structure that has defined Yemeni politics for centuries. Hundreds of autonomous tribes, each controlling its own valley or plateau, each with its own leadership, its own militia, its own alliances, and its own feuds. Every central government that has tried to rule Yemen from a single capital has confronted the same geographic reality. The mountains make it almost impossible to project authority beyond the capital's immediate surroundings without the consent of the tribes who control the terrain. The Ottomans learned this over centuries of failed occupation. The British, who controlled Aden from 1839 to 1967, never seriously attempted to govern the highlands. The two Yemeni states that existed during the Cold War, North Yemen in the highlands and South Yemen on the coast, reflected the geographic split that the terrain itself enforces. When they unified in 1990, the geographic contradictions did not unify with them. They festered until they exploded. If you are learning things about Yemen you never knew, hit that like button for uncharted geography right now. It tells the algorithm to push this to more people who need to understand the geographic forces behind the headlines. East of the highlands, the terrain descends into the eastern plateau, lower mountains and elevated desert ranging from 750 to 1,100 meters. This is drier country, receiving less rain than the western highlands and supporting sparser populations. And beyond the plateau, the terrain drops into the Rub al Khali, the empty quarter, the same vast sand desert that dominates Saudi Arabia to the north. Yemen's share of the empty quarter is among the most uninhabited territory on the Arabian Peninsula. But the geographic feature that has transformed Yemen from a humanitarian crisis into a global security crisis is not the mountains or the desert. It is the coastline. Yemen controls both sides of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, a narrow waterway connecting the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden and the Indian Ocean. Roughly 12% of global seaborne trade passes through this choke point, including a significant portion of the oil and liquefied natural gas flowing between the Persian Gulf and Europe. Any disruption to the Bab el-Mandeb disrupts the Suez Canal because ships that cannot safely enter the Red Sea have no reason to transit the canal at all. This is why Yemen's civil war is not just a Yemeni problem. When the Houthi movement, an armed group rooted in the Zaydi Shia communities of Yemen's northern highlands, seized control of Sana'a in 2014 and subsequently expanded its territory, it gained control of roughly all of former North Yemen, including significant portions of the Red Sea coastline. Since late 2023, the Houthis have leveraged this geographic position to launch attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea, using missiles, drones, and naval mines to target vessels transiting the Bab el-Mandeb. These attacks have forced major shipping lines to reroute around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, adding roughly 2 weeks and significant fuel costs to every voyage. Insurance premiums for Red Sea transit have spiked. The disruption has rippled through global supply chains, raising prices for consumer goods from Europe to East Asia. The Houthis' ability to disrupt global trade is not primarily a function of their military sophistication. It is a function of geography. They control mountainous terrain on the northern shore of the Bab el-Mandeb and along the Red Sea coast. The same mountains that make the highlands ungovernable provide cover for mobile missile launchers and drone facilities. The same coastline that made Yemen strategically valuable for 3,000 years now makes it strategically dangerous. Geography gave the Houthis leverage that no amount of Saudi airstrikes or American naval patrols can fully neutralize, because the geography is permanent and the military operations are not. But beneath the geopolitics, beneath the war, beneath the Houthi attacks, and the Saudi bombing campaign and the international diplomatic failures, there is a slower and more fundamental crisis that geography is driving. Yemen is running out of water. Yemen has no permanent rivers, not one. It is one of the most water-scarce countries on the planet, with annual precipitation averaging between 108 and 114 millimeters nationwide, far below the minimum necessary for either urban or rural communities. The country depends almost entirely on groundwater pumped from aquifers that are being depleted at rates that far exceed natural recharge. Roughly 90% of Yemen's available water goes to agriculture, much of it to irrigate qat, a mildly narcotic plant whose leaves are chewed daily by a majority of Yemeni men. Qat is not a food crop. It has minimal nutritional value, but it is deeply embedded in Yemeni social culture, and it is enormously profitable for farmers. Qat cultivation consumes an estimated 40% of Yemen's irrigation water that in a country facing existential scarcity is being used to grow a recreational stimulant rather than food. The aquifers beneath Sana'a, a city of over 4 million people at 2,300 meters elevation, were projected to run dry as early as the mid-2020s, even before the war began. The conflict has accelerated the crisis. Water infrastructure has been bombed. Desalination capacity is minimal and concentrated on the coast, far from the highland population centers. The cost of trucked water in areas where piped systems have been destroyed has skyrocketed, pushing a resource that was already scarce beyond the reach of millions. Over 14.5 million Yemenis lack access to safe drinking water and sanitation services. The majority live in rural and hard-to-reach areas where no infrastructure exists to deliver water, even if it were available. The cholera outbreaks that have swept Yemen since 2016, among the largest in recorded history with over 2.5 million suspected cases, are a direct consequence of the collapse of water and sanitation systems in a country where water was already desperately scarce before the first shot was fired. The population compounds every geographic pressure. Yemen's population has grown from roughly 12 million in 1990 to over 34 million today. It is one of the fastest growing populations in the Middle East, with a median age of roughly 20 years. Every year, hundreds of thousands of young Yemenis enter a labor market that offers almost nothing: no industrial base, no functioning education system in large parts of the country, no agricultural expansion possible without water that does not exist. The population is growing, the water is shrinking, the arable land is shrinking, the mountains prevent centralized governance, the coastline invites foreign intervention, and the war destroys whatever infrastructure might have mitigated any of these pressures. This is what geographic doom looks like: not a single dramatic event, but the slow convergence of physical constraints that no political arrangement can overcome without addressing the terrain itself. Yemen's mountains created a country of isolated tribes that resist centralization. Yemen's deserts and lack of rivers created a water crisis that predates the civil war by decades. Yemen's coastline placed it on the most strategically sensitive waterway in the Middle East, guaranteeing that any internal conflict would attract external powers. Yemen's population growth filled the mountains and valleys with more people than the geography can sustain, and Yemen's climate, arid, erratic, and warming, is tightening every constraint simultaneously. The 2026 Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan projects that over 22 million Yemenis will need humanitarian assistance this year, an increase of 2.8 million from the previous year. The international appeal for Yemen is $2.16 billion. The 2025 appeal was funded at only 29%. The world is not paying for the crisis it is watching unfold, and the geography does not wait for the funding. The aquifers keep declining. The terraces that Yemeni farmers maintained for 3,000 years are crumbling as conflict and displacement remove the people who maintained them. The Tihama's seasonal floods become less predictable as climate patterns shift. The mountains remain as fragmented and ungovernable as they have been for centuries. The Red Sea remains as strategically critical as it has been since the Romans named this place Happy Arabia and sent their ships through its waters to trade with India. There is one more piece of Yemen's geography that captures the contradiction of this country perfectly. Over 380 kilometers off the southern coast, deeper into the Arabian Sea than any other inhabited point in the region, lies Socotra, an island archipelago so isolated that roughly a third of its plant species exist nowhere else on Earth. The dragon's blood tree, an umbrella-shaped species whose red sap has been harvested for medicine and dye since antiquity, is the island's most famous resident. Socotra was once a prize of the frankincense trade, a stopover for ships moving between India and the Roman Empire. Today it is contested territory in Yemen's civil war, with the UAE-backed Southern Transitional Council asserting control over the island as part of its broader bid for southern independence. Even Yemen's most remote, most ecologically unique, most geographically isolated territory has not been spared the consequences of a mainland geography that produces conflict as reliably as the highlands once produced rain. The irony of Yemen's geographic position extends beyond its coastline. This is a country that sits at the intersection of three continents, Africa, Asia, and Europe, in a way that should make it one of the most connected and commercially vibrant nations in the region. The ancient kingdoms of Saba, Qataban, and Hadramaut grew fabulously wealthy by controlling the overland incense trade routes and the maritime connections between the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean. The port of Aden, sitting at the mouth of the Red Sea at the junction of two of the busiest shipping lanes in the ancient world, was one of the most important commercial hubs on Earth for centuries. The geography that made Yemen wealthy was not an accident. It was a function of position, the same position that now makes it a target. But the wealth of ancient Yemen depended on a specific set of conditions: manageable population, functioning water systems, and trade networks that rewarded geographic position. Every one of those conditions has reversed. The population has tripled since 1990. The water systems have collapsed. And the trade networks that once enriched Yemen now bypass it entirely, flowing through the Suez Canal and the Strait of Hormuz, while Yemen's ports sit damaged and blockaded. Arabia Felix, Happy Arabia. The Romans looked at Yemen and saw green mountains, monsoon rains, fertile terraces, and trade routes that produced incalculable wealth. They were not wrong. Yemen's geography did produce all of those things, but it also produced the fragmentation, the scarcity, the strategic vulnerability, and the ungovernable terrain that made everything it built impossible to sustain. The mountains that caught the rain also isolated the tribes. The coastline that attracted trade also attracted empires. The water that fed the terraces was never enough for a modern population, and the beauty of the highlands, the green valleys, the ancient stone cities, the terraced slopes climbing toward the clouds, masks a geographic reality that is as unforgiving as any desert. Yemen was not destroyed by war alone. It was built on a geography that made destruction almost inevitable. And until the world understands that, until policy moves beyond ceasefires and aid shipments and addresses the terrain itself, the cycle will continue. Because the mountains are not going anywhere, the water is not coming back. And 34 million people are living in a landscape that history called happy and geography designed to collapse. If this video changed how you see Yemen and the forces that created its crisis, make sure you are subscribed to Uncharted Geography. We cover the places and stories that the headlines ignore, the geographic realities that explain why the world looks the way it does. Hit subscribe, leave a comment telling me what country or crisis you want us to explore next, and I will see you in the next one.